I had always wanted a quiet escape, away from the chaos of London. In the spring of 2017, I finally rented a small cabin in the Scottish Highlands, somewhere near Loch Lomond, far enough from towns that I wouldn't see anyone for hours. I was 32, and the idea of a week alone with just my dog, Buster, a scrappy terrier mix, sounded perfect. The cabin itself was old, built of dark timber, with a slanted roof and a tiny stone chimney that still smoked faintly from the last occupants. The air smelled of damp pine and wet earth, and a light drizzle had been falling all morning when we arrived. The road leading to the cabin was rough, barely more than a track through dense woodland. As we got closer, the trees grew thicker, their branches scratching at the sides of the car. Buster growled a little, his ears perked, but I told myself it was just the unfamiliar smells. The moment I opened the cabin door, a cold draft swept in. The interior was dim, lit by a small fireplace, and smelled of wood smoke and mildew. I set my bag down, letting Buster explore while I started unpacking. The first night was unsettling. I had expected silence, but there was something different about this place. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and the rain tapped insistently against the roof. I heard noises outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but I dismissed them as wildlife. Still, every now and then, I caught glimpses of something moving past the windows, always staying just out of focus. The second day, I went for a long walk along the edge of the loch. The water was gray and cold, and the mist rolled over the hills like smoke. Buster ran ahead, sniffing the ground, ears twitching at every sound. I felt a faint unease, a chill that wasn't just from the wind. On my way back, I noticed a figure among the trees, standing motionless. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but the shape was too still, too stiff, and I could barely see through the rain. Then it vanished. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. That night, the feeling returned. I was lying in bed, Buster curled against my legs, when I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, scraping slightly against the wood. My heart hammered. I got up quietly, grabbed a flashlight, and moved to the door. Outside, the rain had eased, and the forest was silent. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it was a branch falling or some animal, but a part of me couldn't shake the sense of being watched. On the third day, I decided to explore more of the surrounding woods. The path led to an overgrown trail, winding between trees dripping with moss. The mist clung to the ground, curling around the roots. I felt tense, alert to every sound: the rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the squelch of mud under my boots. Then I saw her. She was standing near a clearing, just beyond some thick ferns. At first, she looked like she was waiting for someone, but the moment I focused, something about her felt off. Her hair was long and unkempt, tangled with leaves, and her coat was dark, wet, and hanging in strange folds. Her face was pale, almost gray, with eyes that didn't seem quite human. They were too wide, too sharp, and fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. Buster barked, low and warning, and crouched behind me. I froze. She didn't move, but I could feel her gaze burning into me. Every instinct screamed to run, but I knew that sudden movements could provoke something unpredictable. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on her. She didn't follow at first. I turned and ran, slipping in mud, my lungs burning. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against it, shaking. Buster was still growling, hackles raised. For the rest of the day, I avoided the windows. I peered out occasionally, but the forest seemed empty. Still, at night, I could hear faint noises, soft footsteps in the distance, scraping against the undergrowth. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make sleep impossible. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone lived nearby, maybe a local hiker, maybe just animals. But the way she had watched me, standing motionless, was something different. The fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay inside forever. I set out with Buster in the morning, keeping a hatchet in my hand, moving cautiously. I stuck to the main trail this time, avoiding the area where I had seen her. Hours passed, nothing happened. I started to think perhaps I had imagined her entirely, that stress and isolation had played tricks on me. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw a movement among the trees, a flash of wet, dark clothing. My heart sank. She was there again, standing perfectly still, just like before. But this time, something clicked in me. I noticed the pattern. She stayed at the edges of my view, never stepping fully into the open. I realized she might not be supernatural or unreal, but someone living in these woods, hidden, watching, possibly dangerous. I decided then to end the isolation. I returned to the cabin, packed quickly, and called a local taxi service I had noted earlier. While waiting, I kept watch. She appeared again, just on the tree line, tilting her head as if curious, but making no move. I didn't wait for her to act. I grabbed my bags, got Buster, and ran to the edge of the road where the taxi had said it would arrive. When the car appeared, I waved frantically, my hands shaking. She didn't follow, at least not past the trees. I got in, slammed the door, and told the driver to go fast. From the window, I watched the cabin disappear into the gray mist, then the outline of the forest, and eventually, the roads back to more populated areas. My hands were still trembling hours later, but Buster finally relaxed, his tail thumping lightly against my leg. I never saw her again. Later, I learned from a local that a woman had been living in the woods for years, avoiding contact with anyone, sometimes wandering close to cabins and trails. People called her the Hermit Woman, and everyone knew not to approach her. Knowing she was real, human, and not some supernatural figure made it even more chilling. She wasn't malicious in an obvious way, just unpredictable, a reminder that even in modern places, wildness and danger could hide in plain sight. The experience taught me to respect solitude and the untamed parts of the world, but also to stay cautious. I never went back to that cabin, and I've avoided the highlands entirely since then. Every so often, when I close my eyes at night, I remember her pale, sharp eyes, standing still among the trees, and Buster's low growl. It wasn't fear that lingers, it was awareness. Real danger isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's silent, patient, and watching. I never told anyone else where I went or why I left so quickly. Some might say I overreacted, but I know what I saw. That week in the Scottish Highlands remains one of the clearest, sharpest memories I have. The wet wood, the mist over the loch, the smell of the cabin, and the way a woman could exist so close, invisible and waiting, yet entirely real. I learned that week that isolation can be dangerous in ways we rarely expect, and that the world, even in its quiet corners, can hold something eerily human and unknowable. It was the summer of 1998 when I first stumbled upon the cabin. I had been driving through the back roads of northern Wisconsin, taking a small detour from my usual route, just to stretch my legs and see something different. I was 26 at the time, freshly out of college, and working a temporary job at a local construction company. Life felt ordinary, predictable, and I wanted a taste of something wild, something raw that reminded me I was alive. I never expected to find it in the form of a decaying cabin tucked deep into the woods, far off the beaten path. The road to the cabin had already started to test my patience. A thin dirt trail, mostly overgrown with weeds, branched off from the main forest road. The kind of path where your tires sink slightly into soft earth, and every bump sends a shiver up your spine. Trees pressed in on either side like tall, silent sentinels, blocking the sunlight. Birds chirped sporadically, but the sound felt distant, almost like it was echoing from somewhere else entirely. As I drove, I noticed the air smelled heavier, damp with the musty scent of wet leaves and pine needles that had rotted into the soil. Finally, I saw it. A small, grayish-brown cabin sitting alone in a clearing. Its roof sagged in the middle, boards split and peeling, windows cracked or missing entirely. The paint, whatever color it had once been, had long faded or chipped away, leaving the raw wood exposed to the weather. There was no path leading to the front door, just tall grass that reached my knees. Even from a distance, the cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades. A cold part of me, something I couldn't explain, felt drawn to it. I parked the car under a cluster of pine trees and stepped out. The air was thick, humid in a way that made my skin stick to my clothes. The forest around me was quiet now, except for the occasional crack of a branch somewhere off in the shadows. I started walking toward the cabin, the grass brushing against my ankles, damp from the morning dew. I remember noticing small details, the way the sun filtered through the trees in thin shafts, catching dust and tiny insects floating in the light. It felt almost too still, like the world had paused for a moment just to watch me. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up. One of the boards sagged so low I had to jump over it. The door itself hung on rusted hinges, barely attached, and I pushed it open with more force than necessary. Inside, the smell hit me immediately. Mold, wet wood, and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood or rusted iron. The air was thick and heavy, and the dust swirled in motes around the weak sunlight streaming through broken windows. I looked around. The cabin had a main room and a small kitchen area to the left. A staircase in the corner led to what had once been a loft, but I could see that half of it had collapsed. The floorboards were brittle, dark with water damage and rot. I tested each step before putting my full weight down, my hands brushing against the walls for balance. The interior smelled of decay, yet there was a strange charm to it, a sense that it had once been loved and lived in, even if now it was only ghosts of memory. I spent a few minutes exploring, noticing the small things. Rusted nails sticking out of the walls, a broken chair lying on its side, a few glass bottles coated with dust, labels faded beyond recognition. The kitchen had an old cast iron stove, blackened with soot, a sink that was cracked and filled with debris. The loft above had remnants of a mattress, yellowed and torn, and a few pieces of clothing moth-eaten and stiff. Every step I took echoed loudly, the cabin amplifying even the smallest noise. I started to get a strange feeling, a prickling along the back of my neck, that I wasn't alone, even though I knew there was no one else around. Then I noticed the tracks, faint, almost imperceptible at first, but visible in the dust on the floor. Footprints leading from the back of the cabin to the front door, then stopping abruptly. They were old, dry, but unmistakably human. And then I realized they weren't alone. Some prints were smaller, lighter, and uneven, like a child's. That made my stomach twist. Whoever had been here last had been careful, leaving no sign of themselves outside, but somehow they left these tracks behind. I climbed the stairs to the loft more cautiously now. Each step groaned ominously, threatening to give way beneath me. The loft smelled worse than the main room, damp and musty, with the added tang of something else. Metal again, but sharper, more recent. I glanced around, trying to spot the source. In the far corner, half hidden beneath the collapsed rafters, I saw it. A rusted tin box, small and dented. My curiosity overcame my hesitation, and I knelt down to open it. Inside were old papers, yellowed with age, and a few coins that had long tarnished. The papers were receipts, letters, and a few faded photographs of a family I didn't recognize. Nothing alarming, just reminders of life that had once existed here. I was about to leave the loft when I heard it, a creak from below. Not from the stairs, not from the floorboards above me, but from somewhere in the main room. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to hear anything else. There it was again, soft, deliberate, a slow scrape across wood. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, or a branch hitting the roof outside. But the sound repeated, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't outside. It was inside. I backed away from the loft edge, careful not to make noise. My mind raced. Could there be someone hiding in the cabin? Squatters, maybe, or another explorer. I remembered the footprints. Someone had been here, maybe recently. Every instinct told me to leave, to run back through the forest, but something kept me rooted in place. I decided to move slowly, descending the stairs step by step, listening, trying to spot the source of the noise. As I reached the bottom, I noticed the back door. It was slightly ajar, just a crack, like someone had opened it and left it swinging. I stepped closer and peered outside. The clearing was empty, the forest still and silent. No footprints, no signs of anyone. I exhaled sharply, relief washing over me, but it was tinged with unease. Whoever had been here had left, or maybe they were still nearby, watching from the trees. I made the decision to leave. I stepped back out onto the porch, closing the creaking door behind me. I glanced at the cabin one last time. It looked harmless in the daylight, just old wood and rotting shingles, but I knew better. I knew that it had been alive with activity at some point, and maybe someone somewhere still remembered it or even claimed it as their own. As I walked back through the overgrown path to my car, I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see a shadow or a figure moving between the trunks. But there was nothing. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove slowly back onto the main road, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Even now, decades later, I can still picture it clearly. The sagging roof, the broken windows, the smell of damp wood, and the faint metallic tang that seemed almost alive. I never went back to that road. Part of me wanted to explore more and understand what had happened there. But another part, a larger part, knew that some places aren't meant to be fully understood. Some corners of the world hold pieces of lives that are gone, memories left behind in the wood and dirt, and it's best to leave them untouched. That summer, the abandoned cabin taught me a simple truth. Even the quietest, most forgotten places can have their own stories, and some of those stories are better left alone. I still remember the winter of 2014, the year I decided to spend a week alone at an old hunting cabin deep in the forests near Iron River, Michigan. I was 29 back then, desperate for a break from the noise of the city, from long shifts, from people. I wanted peace, fresh air, and the feeling of being far from anything man-made. I thought the cabin would give me all that. Instead, it became the place where I learned how real fear feels when there is nothing between you and the quiet, empty world around you. The cabin itself belonged to a distant cousin who barely used it anymore. It sat nearly 4 miles off a dirt road, and even that road barely counted as one. Most of the path was uneven rock, patches of ice, and old tire tracks that looked washed out from dozens of storms. I had to park my truck far back and walk the remaining half-mile through knee-deep snow. My legs burned by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. I remember how small it looked compared to the endless trees behind it. The wooden boards were faded gray, the windows cloudy from age, and the metal chimney leaned a few inches to the left as if the structure itself was tired of standing. A stack of split firewood sat under a crooked tarp that flapped wildly from the wind. Everything around me felt frozen and untouched. No footprints, no tire marks, no trails of animals. Just a white sheet covering everything like a fresh burial. When I pushed open the door, the smell of dust and old pine hit me right away. The inside was simple. One room with a small table, a bunk bed against the wall, a shelf full of canned food, and a wood stove in the corner. The floor creaked under every step as if complaining about the weight. I dropped my backpack onto the bunk and stood for a moment, listening to the muffled wind outside and the faint tapping of branches against the walls. I thought it felt peaceful at the time. The first night passed quietly. I melted snow, heated up a can of soup on the stove, and sat by the window watching the darkness swallow the clearing. There was something about the blackness of the woods that unsettled me, but I told myself it was just the contrast after living under city lights for so long. I fell asleep to the soft cracking of the firewood. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I followed what looked like an old hunting trail, though most of it was covered by snow. The trees were so close together in some places that I could touch both sides just by raising my arms. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. Even the wind seemed to avoid disturbing that part of the forest. Felt wrong, but I kept walking. About an hour in, I found something strange. There was a pile of fresh branches arranged in a rough shape, almost like a shelter frame someone started building and then abandoned. The snow around it was disturbed, but there were no clear footprints, just uneven indentations, too messy to identify. I thought maybe hunters had passed by earlier in the month, though something about the disorder didn't sit right. It looked rushed, sloppy, like someone was moving in a hurry. I didn't stay long. When I returned to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the door. I was sure I had shut it tightly before I left, but now it sat slightly open, just enough for the cold air to leak inside. Snow had blown in across the wooden floor. I tried to convince myself the wind had done it. The latch was old, the wood was warped, maybe it slipped loose. I wiped the snow out and locked the door again, this time checking it twice before stepping back. The uneasiness stayed with me for the rest of the day. That night, I woke up to a sound outside the cabin. It was faint, almost like something heavy being dragged slowly through the snow. I lay completely still on the bunk, listening. The noise didn't repeat, but the silence afterward felt thicker, heavier. I stared at the wooden ceiling until sunrise, unable to fall back asleep. By the third day, the peaceful retreat I imagined had turned into constant tension. I felt watched even when nothing was there. I would step outside and scan the tree line, expecting to see someone or something standing among the branches. Each time I saw nothing, but that didn't make the feeling disappear. It made it worse. That afternoon, I walked behind the cabin to gather more firewood. When I reached the back wall, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were long scratch marks across the wood. Not animal-like claw marks. These were uneven, dragged down lines that looked like they came from metal or stone scraping against the cabin siding. They weren't there when I arrived. Snow had built up along the bottom edges of the scratches, meaning they had to be fresh from the last night. I ran my hand over them and felt splinters. The grooves were deep. Whatever made them pressed hard into the wood. Hard enough to leave marks, but not hard enough to break through the wall. It felt like a warning or maybe an experiment, like someone testing how strong the cabin was. I spent the next hours inside, pacing, checking the windows, checking the lock every few minutes. I couldn't focus on anything. I barely ate. I barely drank water. Every noise outside made my muscles tighten. That night was the worst. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the trees, and the cold felt sharper. I added more wood to the stove and sat near it for warmth. Around midnight, I heard something at the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate pressure. Not like footsteps, more like someone leaning their weight against the wall, shifting their body from one point to another. The wood creaked softly each time. I didn't move, I didn't breathe for a few seconds. The sounds circled the cabin slowly, almost patiently, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake. The steps stopped near the back wall. Then came a soft scraping sound. I knew that sound, the same sound that made those deep marks. I sat there gripping the handle of a hunting knife I'd brought with me, my hands sweating despite the cold. Minutes passed, maybe hours, it was impossible to tell. Eventually, the noises stopped. The forest went still. I stayed awake until daylight. When morning came, I walked outside even though every instinct told me not to. The snow behind the cabin was disturbed again. Not prints, just chaotic drag marks and spots where the snow had been pressed flat as if a knee or elbow had rested there. It made my skin crawl. I decided that was enough. I packed my things, loaded my backpack, and prepared to leave. But before I walked away, I checked the back wall again. New scratches, deeper than the last ones. Now they almost broke through the wood. I didn't wait any longer. I walked fast along the trail, barely looking around. My hands were numb from gripping the straps of my pack. The trees felt closer than before, their shadows darker, the forest quieter. Every few seconds I thought I heard movement behind me, the faint crunch of snow under slow steps. I never turned around to check. I didn't want to see anything. When I finally reached the truck, my chest felt tight from cold and fear. The inside of the windshield was frosted, so I scraped it with shaking hands and started the engine as fast as I could. The moment the tires hit the dirt road, I pressed harder on the gas. I didn't look in the mirror once. I didn't want to risk seeing anything following me out of the woods. By the time I reached the main highway, the sun was already setting behind the trees, turning the snow pink and orange. It should have looked peaceful, but all I felt was relief. Relief that the forest was behind me. Relief that nothing had followed me out. Relief that the cabin was now miles away. I never went back there. I told my cousin he should sell it or let it rot. I didn't give him a reason, and he didn't ask for one. To this day, I still don't know what was outside that cabin. A person, an animal, or something human but not right in the head. Whatever it was, it had been watching me, walking around that cabin night after night, testing the walls, waiting for something. All I know is that if I had stayed one more night, I might have found out. And I don't ever want to know. I never thought I would find myself wandering the backroads of rural Maine in October of 1987. But there I was, following a hand-drawn map I had found tucked inside a library book about old colonial cemeteries. I was 23 at the time, fresh out of college, trying to clear my head after a brutal summer of working in a hospital lab, surrounded by death and illness every day. The idea of a weekend alone in the woods, staying in an old hunting cabin near a long-forgotten graveyard, seemed like a perfect way to breathe and remember that life existed beyond fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. The directions led me down a narrow, twisting dirt road, the wheels of my old Plymouth kicking up a fine layer of red dust. The sun was dipping low behind a forest of dark pines, and a chill had settled in the air that hinted at the coming frost. When I finally spotted the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. A single-story frame shack with weathered wood and a sagging roof. A thin trail of smoke was curling from the chimney, but I didn't see any signs of life around it. The cabin sat on the edge of a clearing, and beyond that, I could just make out the faint shapes of weathered headstones through the growing twilight fog. I parked the car and grabbed my bag, trying not to notice the silence around me. The forest felt dense, almost oppressive, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot made me jump more than once. The cabin's door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of damp wood, old leaves, and something else I couldn't quite place. Like earth that had been turned too many times, or maybe the smell of bodies long gone and buried in the dirt just beyond the walls. The interior was bare but functional. A rickety table, a couple of chairs, a small wood stove, and a bed with a thin, lumpy mattress. Dust lay thick on the floor, disturbed only where someone had clearly walked not long ago. I set my bag down and lit the stove. The first spark of fire seemed to make the shadows in the room stretch and twitch. I didn't turn on a lantern, preferring the way the firelight flickered against the walls. It made the cabin feel alive, in a strange way, even if that life was the creak of the floorboards and the whisper of wind through gaps in the logs. I decided to explore the graveyard before it got completely dark. I wanted to see the old headstones, many of which were partially tipped over or cracked. The names were mostly faded, with only a few letters legible: E. Harlow, 1823, M. Whitman, 1797. Some were just simple markers of stone, others elaborate, with carved angels and weathered inscriptions about life, death, and eternity. I walked slowly, trying to imagine who these people had been, what their lives might have looked like, and why their resting place had been forgotten by everyone but the trees and the wind. As I moved further from the cabin, the forest seemed to close in behind me. The light was fading rapidly, the fog growing thicker, curling around the tombstones and twisting through the trunks of the trees. My flashlight cut a narrow path ahead, but even with it, shapes seemed to move in the corner of my vision. Old roots and stones made the ground uneven, and I stumbled once, catching myself on a gravestone that wobbled dangerously under my weight. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself, my heart pounding harder than I expected. Something caught my eye, barely visible in the mist, a set of footprints in the soft dirt. They were human, large, and appeared fresh. My pulse quickened. The area was supposed to be abandoned. No one had lived nearby for decades, at least according to the map and the local records I had looked up. The footprints led deeper into the graveyard, toward a section where the headstones were older, cracked, and leaning like they were about to topple. I followed cautiously, curiosity battling against a rising sense of dread. Then I saw it. A fresh mound of earth, small but clearly dug within the last few days. The soil was loose, dark, and smelled strongly of wet earth. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here had been digging graves, and recently. My mind raced. Maybe it was a grave robber, or someone looking for something they thought was buried here long ago. I could feel my hands tremble, not just from the cold, but from the awareness that I was completely alone, and maybe I wasn't supposed to be here. I backed away slowly, trying to stay calm. My foot caught on another gravestone, and I stumbled, heart racing. The fog seemed to thicken instantly, as if it were alive, and I realized that I couldn't see the cabin anymore, that it was swallowed by the mist. Panic began to creep in. I turned in a slow circle, trying to pick out a landmark, but the trees and fog blended together, making the world feel small and suffocating. Then I heard it, a soft scrape, like metal against stone, coming from somewhere behind me. My stomach flipped. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, scraping along the ground toward me. I froze, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. The light cut through the fog, but I saw nothing, only the blurred shapes of ancient stones and the shadows of trees. I took a cautious step backward, and the sound stopped. I held my breath, listening. Finally, I realized I couldn't stay there. I had to get back to the cabin before darkness fully swallowed me. I turned and ran, tripping over roots and stones, my flashlight swinging wildly. I could hear branches snapping behind me, and my chest burned as I pushed through the undergrowth. Just when my legs felt like they would give out, I saw the faint glow of the stove through the fog. Relief hit me like a wave, but I didn't stop until I slammed the cabin door shut behind me. Inside, I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. My flashlight lay on the table, the beam bouncing across the room. The shadows seemed calmer now, contained within the walls, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the graveyard outside was watching, waiting. I couldn't stay another night, not after what I had seen or thought I had seen. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking, and loaded them into the car. The fire in the stove went out as I pulled away, leaving the cabin dark and silent again, blending into the forest like it had been waiting for someone to come, to see it, to leave. As I drove back down the winding dirt road, the fog slowly lifted, and the moon rose high, illuminating the misty outlines of the forgotten graves. I didn't look back, but I could feel their presence in the cold night air, reminding me that some places are meant to be left alone. When I finally reached the main road, the first real lights of civilization cutting through the darkness, I realized how fast I had been holding my breath, how tense every muscle in my body had been. I pulled over, shook my head, and tried to process what had happened. There were no ghosts, no fairy tale monsters, only the quiet weight of human history, the unsettling thought of someone else digging graves, and the raw power of isolation. Weeks later, I learned from a local historian that the graveyard had indeed been disturbed several times over the years, sometimes by people looking for valuables, other times by vandals. Nothing had ever been proven, and the authorities had no answers. But the memory of that night stayed with me. The smell of wet earth, the fog thick around ancient stones, the sound of scraping that may or may not have been human. It made me respect places like that, places that carry the weight of lives lived and forgotten. And it taught me a lesson I would never forget. Curiosity is dangerous when combined with isolation, and some places, no matter how fascinating, are better admired from a distance. I never returned to that cabin. Couldn't. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I think about the fog and the old stones, and I understand why some histories are left untouched. And I remember the primal fear of being alone, exposed, and surrounded by the remnants of lives long gone. And I am grateful to have made it back to the living world intact. I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything. The city had been suffocating me for months. Noise, deadlines, traffic, people pushing and shoving through their own lives without a care. I'd rented a small cabin up in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, a place that promised solitude, fresh air, and a few days without a single person to answer to. It was early October, 2018, and the air carried that crisp smell of pine mixed with decaying leaves. The cabin itself was old, built in the 70s, wooden and creaking, with a steep roof and a small porch that overlooked a narrow stream. I brought with me only essentials, a backpack, my dog Baxter, and a couple of books I never ended up opening. The first day passed quietly. Baxter explored the surrounding woods, sticking close to the cabin but darting between trees like he was on some private mission. I unpacked slowly, moved things around until the cabin felt more like mine, though I never really got comfortable with the uneven floorboards that creaked no matter where I stepped. That night, I lit the fireplace and watched the flames flicker against the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, occasionally sending a branch scratching against the cabin's siding. It was a normal sound, I told myself, but it had a certain sharpness that made me jump each time. By the second night, I had settled into a routine. I woke early, made coffee over the gas stove, and walked down to the stream. Baxter ran ahead, sniffing everything. The sky was gray, clouds moving fast as if racing against some unseen clock. I noticed a narrow dirt path winding deeper into the forest. It looked old, barely used, and a shiver ran down my spine as I realized I hadn't seen it on any map. There was something unsettling about it, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The real tension started that evening. I was sitting at the small wooden table, Baxter asleep at my feet, when I heard it. A sound, almost a whisper, but sharp enough to make me freeze. It wasn't wind, it had rhythm. A footstep. I froze, listening. Then another. Slow, deliberate, and moving toward the cabin. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker, someone passing by, but the cabin was tucked far into the woods. People rarely came this deep. The steps stopped suddenly. I couldn't see anything through the window. The glass reflected the firelight, showing nothing but my own wide-eyed face and Baxter's twitching ears. Hours passed before I dared move. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the roof, made me flinch. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but my hands shook. I kept checking the locks on the doors, the old metal latches that didn't feel particularly secure. At one point, I thought I heard scratching on the door frame, slow and deliberate. Baxter growled softly, his low rumble vibrating through the floor. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy fireplace poker. I wasn't planning on doing anything. Not really. I just needed to see, to convince myself there wasn't someone hiding outside. I stepped out onto the porch. The wind tore at my jacket, the moonlight barely illuminating the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing, just the trees swaying, the stream gurgling over rocks, and Baxter pawing at the porch boards. I walked around the cabin slowly, shining the flashlight in every corner, checking behind trees and the stacked firewood. Nothing. I cursed under my breath, feeling my pulse slow only slightly, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep came fitfully. I dreamt of someone standing just beyond the tree line, always watching, never moving. I woke to the sound of shattering glass. My body went rigid. Baxter bolted upright, growling and barking. I grabbed the flashlight, moving toward the source. It was the kitchen window. A small stone had smashed through it, leaving jagged shards around the frame and the counters. No note, no explanation, just a stone. My first real wave of fear hit me cold and heavy. Someone had been there. Someone had come close enough to throw a rock through the window. I spent the next day in a haze. I didn't venture far from the cabin, didn't go near the dirt path. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. Every bird taking flight seemed like a warning. I called the local ranger station from the cabin, but the line was busy, then dead. No one else seemed to know I was there. By the evening, I realized I had to take action. I couldn't sit and wait. I went into the small supply closet and found a first aid kit, extra batteries, and some rope. I set up a rudimentary alarm system. Tripwires with tin cans, simple, but enough to alert me if someone tried to approach. Night came, and it was worse than the first. The wind carried an almost human rhythm this time, like someone pacing. I kept Baxter close, flashlight in one hand, poker in the other. Hours passed. Then I heard it. Snapping twigs, faint, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. Then the tin can clanged loudly as a wire snapped. I jumped, swinging the flashlight toward the sound. There, crouched by the far edge of the clearing, a man stared at the cabin. He wore dark clothing and a hood, his face partially shadowed. He didn't move, didn't run, just stared. My mind raced, panic rising. I screamed and charged forward, swinging the poker. The man bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, vanishing into the darkness. The rest of the night was tense. I didn't sleep, sitting by the fire with Baxter trembling beside me. I considered leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and night made it impossible. By morning, I knew I had to make a plan. I packed a bag quickly, checked the car. I had to get out of there and call the police. I left the cabin quietly, walking the long trail down to the main road. I kept my eyes on the trees the whole way. At one point, I thought I saw movement, but it was just a deer. My hands were blistered from clutching the poker the entire hike. I reached the road and flagged down a car. The driver was shocked by my state. Dirty, exhausted, shaking. I told him my story in broken bursts, and he drove me to the nearest town, where I called the authorities. They sent a ranger team the next day. When I returned with them, the cabin showed signs of intrusion. Footprints in the mud, a faintly burned area near the fireplace where someone had tried to start a fire. The dirt path I had noticed was a real path, worn from years of use, leading directly to the cabin. No one had lived there recently, yet someone had been tracking it, watching. It took weeks to stop feeling the tension in my chest, the constant fear of being followed. I never returned to that cabin, but in the long term, I found a sense of relief in what happened. I realized I had survived, and not by luck. I had stayed aware, cautious, and ready to act. Baxter stayed with me, his presence a constant reassurance. I kept the flashlight and the poker stored away, reminders of that night. I rented another cabin later, in a more populated area, and though I still go into the woods for solitude, I never take it for granted. That night taught me something simple but crucial. Being alone in nature doesn't mean being safe, and vigilance isn't paranoia, it's survival. Even now, years later, I can't hear a twig snap without my body tensing. But I also know that fear doesn't have to paralyze you, can make you sharper, stronger, more alive. And that, strangely enough, is a good ending because I walked out of that forest alive, unhurt, and wiser than I was before. I moved out to the woods after retiring from the force. After 32 years on the streets of Cleveland, answering the worst calls a person could imagine, I wanted peace. I found a small, weathered cabin tucked in the Appalachian foothills, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The year was 1998, and I was 62, my body worn from decades of chasing down criminals, my mind exhausted from constant vigilance. I didn't want anyone around. Just me, my dog Duke, a German Shepherd I'd rescued from a shelter years back, and the quiet I could no longer find in the city. The cabin itself was old but solid, built from heavy timber with a stone foundation. It creaked and groaned like it had its own voice. I spent the first few weeks cleaning it out, stacking firewood, repairing a leaky roof, and getting the small propane heater running. I liked the smell of pine that came from the logs and the faint musk of old wood. Duke explored every corner, sniffing and whining at little noises, alerting me to things I couldn't see yet. Life settled into a routine. Mornings started with a strong cup of black coffee brewed over the old propane stove. Duke and I would walk the trail behind the cabin, the forest thick with oak, hickory, and maple. I kept my retired sidearm close, not because I feared ghosts or fairy tale monsters, but because the woods could be dangerous. Wild animals, poachers, and the occasional lost traveler could turn violent. It was a precaution I didn't argue with. One week in November, the weather turned cold faster than usual. The nights were long and harsh, and snow dusted the forest floor before settling thickly by the middle of the month. I noticed the first strange thing one evening while I chopped wood. The echo of my axe against the log sounded different, duller, somehow muffled. Duke stiffened beside me, ears erect, hackles raised. I scanned the treeline. Nothing. The wind whispered through the trees, but it wasn't wind that made Duke growl low in his throat. That night, I went to bed early. Duke slept at the foot of my bed, as he always did. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something scraping against the cabin door. Not a tap, not a knock, scraping. Slow, deliberate. My first thought was a branch in the wind, but the sound didn't match the gusting wind outside. Duke was growling now, his teeth bared. I stayed still, listening. The scraping continued for several long minutes, then stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight finally came, I grabbed my rifle and walked the perimeter. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints in the new snow, no signs that anyone had been there. Just the tracks Duke and I had made yesterday. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a fox. I didn't say it aloud, but part of me knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't have patience like that. A few days passed, and the scraping returned, sometimes at night, sometimes at dusk. It was always slow, almost polite, but it was deliberate. Duke would growl, and I would sit quietly, rifle across my lap, until the noise faded. I started boarding up some of the windows with extra planks I had in the shed. The cabin was old, yes, but it was strong, and the planks made me feel better. I could see the forest, but now it was just the forest, not the unknown outside. One evening, the sound changed. It wasn't the door anymore, it was the back wall. A slow thud, 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 like someone testing the boards. Duke barked sharply, running to the door behind the cabin. I followed, heart pounding. Nothing. I checked the perimeter again. The snow outside was undisturbed, not a single footprint. That's when I realized whoever or whatever it was, they knew how to stay invisible. They weren't careless. I spent that night in the cabin with the lights on, every window boarded, the rifle close at hand. I kept one ear on Duke's quiet snoring, the other on the creaks and pops of the old wood. Hours passed. At one point, I heard a faint whisper of movement near the shed. I froze. The sound stopped, and I waited. Eventually, exhaustion won. I slept lightly, waking at intervals, always with my hand near the rifle. The next morning, I found a small, strange sign on the snow near the back door. A single, thin branch bent to point toward the cabin. No footprints, just the branch. My stomach sank. Whoever had been testing me wasn't playing, they were watching, waiting. I realized then that my years as a cop had trained me for every scenario except this one. There were no suspects, no clues, no clear threat, but the danger was real. I spent the next few days preparing. I reinforced the cabin with heavier boards, dug a small trench around the perimeter in case someone tried to get close, and kept a small stockpile of firewood, water, and food in case I had to sit it out. Duke stayed closer than ever, growling at every shadow, every wind-blown leaf. I began sleeping with the rifle across my chest and my boots on the floor. Then one night it happened. The back wall groaned, and the boards started cracking under deliberate force. I grabbed the rifle and approached quietly, Duke at my heels. I could see the faint outline of someone or something through the gaps in the snow-dusted boards. I didn't hesitate. I fired a warning shot over their head. Silence. The figure disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing behind. No prints. Nothing. I didn't wait for morning. I packed my essentials and, with Duke, hiked the 15 miles to the nearest road, flagging down a passing truck. I told the driver I needed help and didn't wait for questions. The sheriff's office sent a team back with me the next day, but there was no one. No tracks, no evidence, nothing that would explain what had happened. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them. I didn't return to that cabin. I rented a small, secure house on the edge of town. Duke was calmer now, but he never forgot the fear of that forest. For months, I would wake up at night, convinced I could hear scraping on a door, feel the presence of eyes outside. I told myself it was over, but the tension lingered. It took me a long time to feel safe again, even in a neighborhood with streetlights and neighbors. Years later, I would sometimes drive past that part of the Appalachians. I'd look at the thicket where the cabin had been and shiver. Whoever it was, or whatever they were, had taught me something I couldn't unlearn. Even the most prepared, even the most careful, can be caught off guard by someone patient, determined, and invisible. And that lesson stayed with me, sharper than any badge I ever wore. I never went back. Duke stayed with me until he passed, old and gray like I was now. I kept my firearms, my precautions, my routines. The forest wasn't safe, and I had learned the hard way that sometimes, even the calmest life can be invaded in ways you can't anticipate. But I survived. I stayed alive. and that, for a retired cop, is always the best ending. I had always wanted a place to escape, a small corner of the world where the hum of daily life didn't follow me, where I could breathe in silence and let my mind wander without interruption. In the summer of 2004, at 27, I finally found that place, a small patch of land tucked away in the northern hills of Vermont. It wasn't much, just a few acres of uneven forest with a creek cutting through it, but it was mine, and it felt like freedom. I spent weeks gathering supplies, planning the cabin I wanted to build. I wasn't an expert, just a determined man with a hammer and saw and a stubborn will to do it myself. The first week of November had been unusually cold for that year. The nights crept down to the low 30s, and the days were gray, thick with clouds that never seemed to clear. I had managed to cut enough timber and stone to start building the cabin's frame. It was small, a single room with a loft for sleeping, enough to keep me dry and warm through the winter. The walls were raw, unpainted planks, the roof a simple slanting structure of shingles I nailed myself. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid, and that mattered more than anything. One evening, I noticed a storm moving in. The clouds were rolling fast, black and heavy, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth and pine. By the time I had finished securing the last corner of the roof, rain was beginning to fall, light at first, then harder, pounding the thin shingles like stones. I lit a small lantern inside, setting it on the workbench I had made from an old plank and some tree stumps. Its light flickered against the rough walls, casting long, uneven shadows. Outside, the world became a curtain of gray water, the trees bending with the wind, and the creek swollen with rainwater, gurgling angrily as it ran over rocks and roots. I had eaten a meager dinner of canned beans and stale bread earlier and decided to make a fire in the small stone fireplace I had built. The first few sparks caught slowly, smoke curling and filling the cabin until I fanned it with a piece of cardboard. Soon the fire was roaring, its warmth seeping into my bones. I sat on a wooden crate I used as a chair, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, watching the rain hammer the roof. The storm made the world outside unrecognizable, the trees blurring together, the creek sounding like it might overflow and wash everything away. As the night deepened, the rain didn't let up. It became relentless, a constant roar. I could hear branches snapping under the weight of water, hitting the ground with wet thuds. The wind whipped the cabin walls, making the whole structure creak and shiver. At one point, I thought I heard something else, something deliberate. A rustling, a dragging noise coming from outside. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was the storm, a branch or a fallen tree being swept away. Still, I grabbed the small hatchet I kept beside the fire and held it loosely in my hand. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. I just sat and listened, letting my ears adjust to the storm. Hours passed, and the storm didn't relent. The cabin, which had seemed solid and safe in the day, now felt fragile against the elements. Rainwater had found small leaks in the roof, dripping onto the floor in thin streams. I mopped them up with old rags, my hands raw from the cold and work. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. Every louder crash made me grip the hatchet tighter. I realized I wasn't just fighting the storm. I was fighting the fear that had crept into me, a fear of being completely alone in a vast, angry forest. Around midnight, the worst part of the storm hit. The wind howled like it had a mind of its own, tearing at the walls, bending the small trees around the cabin as if they were made of paper. Rain struck the windows with such force I could barely see outside, but I tried anyway. That's when I saw movement, a figure wet and hunched, stumbling along the edge of the forest near the creek. My first thought was that it was some local hunter, lost in the storm, but the figure didn't carry a flashlight or an axe. It moved oddly, slowly, as if weighed down. My heart thumped in my chest, my pulse rattling in my ears. I stayed very still, hoping it would pass. The figure disappeared behind a thicket, and I tried to convince myself I hadn't really seen anything, that it was a trick of the shadows and rain. But the feeling didn't leave me. I checked the locks on the makeshift door, moved the hatchet closer, and sat as close to the fire as I could without getting burned. Sleep was impossible. Every sound was magnified. The crack of the fire, the patter of rain, the occasional distant roar of the creek as it swelled. I realized how isolated I truly was. I had deliberately chosen this, but now I understood the weight of it. Morning came gray and cold, the rain easing into a drizzle. The forest was drenched, the cabin wet and steaming, smelling of damp wood and moss. I stepped outside cautiously, the ground squishing under my boots. The creek was higher than it had ever been, water rushing over its banks. And then I saw it, tracks in the mud. Heavy footprints, muddy and deep, leading from the forest toward the cabin and then circling around it before heading back into the trees. Whoever or whatever had been outside had come close. Close enough that I could have reached out and touched them if I had been outside. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I nailed extra planks over the gaps, sealed the cracks as best I could with mud and leaves, and built a small barrier of stones along the lower wall to prevent water from seeping in again. I worked with a focus I hadn't known I possessed, driven by the mixture of fear and determination. I realized that the storm and the night's events had exposed vulnerabilities I hadn't considered. The cabin was my refuge, but it wasn't just the rain I needed protection from. It was the world itself, unpredictable and sometimes hostile. By nightfall, the storm had fully passed, leaving only a damp, quiet forest. I lit the fire again, the sound of wood crackling a comfort. I checked the hatchet, placed it within reach, and for the first time all night, allowed myself to sit back and breathe. I understood then that fear was natural, but it didn't have to control me. I had built the cabin with my own hands, survived a terrifying night, and I could continue to make it stronger. The next morning, the sun broke through low clouds, shining on wet leaves and sparkling on the creek. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and alive. I stepped outside, surveyed the land, and realized that the night had changed me. I had come here seeking solitude, but I had found resilience. The storm had been harsh, frightening, and exhausting, but it had shown me what I was capable of. I knew I could face whatever the forest or life threw at me because I had faced the worst of it alone and endured. I spent the rest of that autumn and winter improving the cabin, building a small woodpile, reinforcing the roof, and storing enough food to last through the snow. By spring, it wasn't just a rough shelter. It was a home, safe, warm, and resilient. The memory of that rainy night stayed with me, not as a haunting, but as proof that I could survive, adapt, and even thrive in solitude. That cabin, built by my own hands in a remote forest, became more than wood and nails. It became a symbol of strength, of endurance, and of the quiet triumph of persistence over fear. And every time I light the fire and hear the crackle of the logs, I remember the storm, the fear, the footprints in the mud, and I smile quietly to myself, knowing that I faced it all and came out stronger. I drove into the northern part of Wyoming in late autumn of 2019, a time when the air felt thin and sharp even during the day. I was 33 then, worn out from a year that had been nothing but work, stress, and sleepless nights. A friend of mine had let me use his old hunting cabin for a week, a place he said was quiet and far from everything. I wanted that. I wanted silence, cold air, and empty days. I reached the cabin just before sunset. The building stood alone in a clearing surrounded by tall, pale pines. The roof sagged slightly at the edges, and the wooden boards looked gray from years of weather. The place smelled like dust and old smoke the moment I stepped inside. It felt abandoned, like no one had touched anything in years. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen that barely worked, a wood stove, and a narrow porch facing the thickest part of the woods. I spent the first night unpacking and setting up a fire. The air was colder than I thought, even indoors. I remember sitting on a wooden chair near the stove, listening to the wood crack as it burned. It was the only sound for miles. The silence made me uneasy at first, but I told myself I came here for that exact reason. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke up early because something brushed against the side of the cabin. A slow sliding sound, like something heavy was moving just outside the wall. I waited, holding still under my blanket, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I assumed it was a deer rubbing against the wood. They were common in places like this, so I didn't think too much about it. Later that day, while I was splitting wood behind the cabin, I noticed footprints near the tree line. They were spaced strangely, like whatever made them moved in uneven steps. The prints looked human, but not quite right. The toes seemed too long, and the heel marks were deep, like someone had been leaning forward as they walked. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to understand the shape. The ground was still soft from last week's rain, so the prints were clear and fresh. They hadn't been there the night before. I felt a pressure in my chest as I walked back toward the cabin. The sky had turned a light gray, and the wind picked up, stirring the branches. The woods around me felt too quiet all of a sudden, like everything was holding its breath. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, something tapped against the window of the small kitchen. It was slow and steady, the kind of tapping you hear when a branch knocks against glass. But there were no trees close enough to touch the cabin. I stared at the dark window from across the room. I didn't move toward it. I didn't want to see anything on the other side. The tapping stopped after a while, but a new sound replaced it. It was soft breathing. For a moment, I thought it was the wind forcing its way through cracks in the wall. But the breathing had a rhythm. Slow inhale, shaky exhale. It came from directly outside the window. I stayed awake until dawn. On the third day, the forest felt different. Even during daylight, I felt watched. The trees seemed to close in around the clearing, their shadows longer than usual. When I walked the small trail behind the cabin, I heard something mimic the sound of footsteps behind me. Every time I stopped walking, the footsteps stopped too. When I started again, they started again. The noise always stayed the same distance behind me, never closer, never farther. I didn't turn around. My skin crawled from the feeling of eyes on my back. I walked faster, focusing on the cabin roof peeking through the trees. That evening, a smell drifted toward the cabin. A strong, sour, metallic smell that reminded me of blood left out in the sun. It hung in the air, thick and heavy. I checked around the cabin and found nothing. No dead animal, no trash, nothing that made sense. The smell just appeared and then faded, replaced by the cold scent of pine. When darkness fell again, the noises returned. Something moved on the porch, its weight heavy enough to make the wooden boards creak. I sat in the bedroom, holding my breath, staring at the crack under the door. The thing outside walked slowly from one end of the porch to the other, then back again, over and over. The rhythm never changed. It sounded like someone pacing. Hours passed before the sound finally stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat against the wall with my legs pulled close to my chest, waiting for the sun. On the fourth day, I found something on the edge of the clearing. A piece of torn fabric caught on a branch. It looked like the sleeve of a jacket, dark blue and stained with dirt. It was ripped at the seam like someone had pulled it off with force. The fabric felt damp when I touched it, as if it hadn't been there long. Nearby, the strange footprints appeared again, leading deeper into the woods. They circled the clearing, looping around the cabin in uneven patterns. At one point, the prints came right up to the cabin wall, stopping directly below my bedroom window. I felt a cold wave rush through me when I saw that. I imagined something standing there in the dark, staring up at me while I slept. That was the moment I decided I needed to leave. But the road out of the woods was long, and my truck sat at the end of the narrow trail behind the cabin. I spent the day packing my bags, trying to convince myself I was just anxious. But every few minutes, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. Something pale slipping behind a trunk. Something crouched low near the ground. Something standing too still for too long. As dusk approached, I stepped onto the porch with my backpack. The forest felt dead. Not a single sound of birds or wind, just stillness. I walked the trail quickly, staying alert. The path curved through the trees, and the deeper I went, the darker the woods became. My breathing was sharp in the cold air. My hands shook as I held onto the straps of my backpack. Halfway to the truck, I heard something on my right, a low, dragging sound across the dirt. I kept walking, but the sound followed. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the trail. Then I saw it. Standing between the trees ahead of me, half hidden by the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with its shoulders hunched forward. Its limbs were too long, and its posture looked twisted, like it was trying to stand like a person but couldn't quite manage it. Its skin looked pale, stretched tight over its bones. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was watching me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then it stepped forward, slow and unsteady, like it was learning how to use its legs. The sound it made wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't a human sound either. It was something in between, something that felt wrong in every way. I didn't run. I walked backwards slowly, keeping my eyes on it. When I reached a bend in the trail, I turned and forced myself into a fast, steady walk. My lungs burned. My legs shook. I didn't look behind me again. The moment I reached my truck, I threw my bag inside and started the engine. The woods around me were silent, but I felt the same pressure I felt on the first day, the weight of eyes. I kept my hands tight on the wheel as I drove down the long dirt road, not stopping until I reached the highway miles away. Only when the cabin was far behind me did I let myself breathe normally again. I never went back for the leftover things I left inside the cabin. I never asked my friend if he wanted the key returned. I didn't want to think about that place anymore. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night with the same feeling I had in those woods. Like something is standing just out of sight, watching me, waiting for me to slip back into the silence of that clearing. And every now and then, when I'm alone and the house settles in the dark, I hear the faint creak of wooden boards, the same slow pacing I heard on the cabin porch, the same steady rhythm, and I know it never lost track of me. I was 31 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a rental cabin deep in northern Minnesota. I had been working long nights at a warehouse and felt worn down in a way I couldn't explain. My head felt heavy every morning, and I was starting to forget simple things. I told myself I needed a break from crowds, alarms, and metal doors slamming shut every shift. I found the cabin on a simple listing site. It was cheap, isolated, and near a lake with no real name, just a number on the map. That felt perfect to me. The drive took almost 8 hours. The last hour was nothing but narrow gravel roads with tall pine trees leaning inward like they were trying to hide something behind them. Every now and then, the road dipped and my stomach lifted slightly. It was late afternoon when I reached the small dirt clearing where the cabin sat. It was a single-floor wooden structure with a sagging porch, broken steps, and windows that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. The lake was behind it, a few hundred feet away, and the water looked dark even in daylight. The air smelled like wet soil and old leaves. Inside, the cabin was smaller than I expected. There was one bedroom with a thin mattress, a kitchen area with mismatched drawers, and a living room with a wood stove that looked older than me. Dust covered the corners of everything. When I set my bag down, the floor creaked in a long, slow way, like it was complaining about new weight. I felt a little uneasy, but the silence was something I needed. No cars, no people, just wind pressing through the trees. The first day passed quietly. I walked near the lake, took slow breaths, and felt my shoulders loosen. At night, I made a small fire in the stove. The burning wood crackled softly. I turned off the lamp and let the room fill with the warm orange glow. Outside, the forest was nothing but darkness. I could hear frogs and the occasional splash from the lake. Everything felt still, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of stillness that made me overly aware of my own breathing and the small sounds inside the walls. The second night is when things shifted. I had been sitting on the porch watching the last bit of sunlight fade. The sky looked almost purple, and a thin layer of fog floated above the lake. When I finally went inside, I shut the door fully and checked the lock even though I had no reason to. I cooked something simple and sat on the couch with my feet up. At some point, I dozed off. When I woke up, it was around 1 a.m. The fire had died down to small red embers, and the room felt colder than it should have. My skin prickled with the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I stood up to grab another log when I noticed the front door. It was slightly open, not wide, just enough that I could see a thin line of darkness where I knew there shouldn't be any. My stomach tightened immediately. I knew I had shut it fully. I remembered the click of the lock. I remembered pulling on it once to make sure it caught. Now it sat open by just an inch or two, no sound, no movement. I walked toward it slowly, my steps careful. The cold air creeping in felt sharper the closer I got. I pushed the door shut, locked it again, and stood there with my hand on the knob longer than necessary. I tried to tell myself that the old wood had shifted or the frame wasn't straight, but the lock had been engaged. Old wood couldn't turn a lock. I put another log in the stove, sat back on the couch, and tried to relax. But it felt wrong now. The cabin seemed quieter in a threatening way. The wind outside had stopped. Even the lake seemed silent. I eventually went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak in the cabin made my eyes snap open. Morning came slowly. The air was still cold, and the light coming through the window looked dull. I stepped out onto the porch to get fresh air. That's when I saw the footprints. They were on the dirt patch right in front of the steps. Bare feet, adult-sized. The toes were wide apart, the heel shaped deep. The soil was soft enough that every detail was clear. They led from the tree line straight toward my cabin and stopped at the porch steps. There were none going away, just the ones coming in. I stared at them for a long time. My heart felt like it was beating slower but harder, each beat heavy. I didn't want to touch the footprints or get closer. The forest behind them looked too dense, like someone could be standing just inside the shadows watching me. I stepped backward slowly and went inside, locking the door again. The rest of the day felt wrong. I stayed inside mostly, listening for anything. Once, I thought I heard a branch snap behind the cabin, but when I looked out the back window, I saw nothing but trees. Around sunset, I walked to the lake to clear my head. The water was calm, but the reflection of the trees looked warped. The lake was so dark that it felt like staring into a hole instead of water. I didn't stay long. That night, I didn't fall asleep on the couch. I stayed awake, lying on my side on the bed, listening to every sound. My mind kept going back to the footprints, the bare feet, the direction, no return tracks. I kept imagining someone standing just outside the cabin, staring at the walls, silent, patient. Sometime after midnight, I heard the porch boards creak. It was slow and steady. One step, then another, then another. The steps were too controlled to be an animal. My muscles locked up. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps reached the door and stopped. Seconds passed. Then more. Then more. I could hear nothing except my pulse pounding in my ears. The door didn't move. The handle didn't turn. But whoever was out there stayed long enough that I felt sweat slowly forming on my back. When the footsteps finally moved away, I didn't get up to check. I stayed frozen until the sky outside turned faintly gray. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things without eating, without thinking much. I took one last look outside and saw nothing on the porch, but I didn't feel safe. I kept expecting something to move in the trees. I locked the door behind me even though I knew it didn't matter much now. But when I walked around to put my bag in the car, I froze again. There were new footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, same bare feet, same size, but this time they came from behind the cabin and circled it once, almost a full loop. Then they stopped by the back window, the one I had looked out of the night before. The prints were deep, like whoever stood there had been standing still for a long time, watching. I didn't think anymore. I just got in the car, turned the key so fast my wrist cracked, and drove down the gravel road without looking back. Every mile I drove felt like something heavy was lifting off my chest. When I finally reached the highway, I felt air fill my lungs fully for the first time in days. Now, months later, when I think about that week, the thing that unsettles me the most isn't the open door or the footprints circling the cabin. It's the thought of that moment on the second night, the long, silent pause outside my door. I know someone was standing there. I know they had been watching the cabin for hours, maybe longer, but the clearest part of all is the ending. I left early, I left fast, and I never went back. And I know deep down that leaving when I did was the only reason the story ended cleanly at all. Because whoever left those footprints wasn't passing by. They were waiting, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have been the one to open the door in the morning. I drove into the countryside of northern Arkansas in late October of 2019, trying to get away from the noise of my life for a few days. I had been working long hours at a warehouse, barely sleeping, barely eating right, and I felt myself reaching a point where everything around me made me angry or tired. A coworker told me about an old farm cabin his uncle owned that nobody used anymore. It sat at the far end of a wide patch of farmland that had once been active but was now quiet and partly overgrown. He gave me the key and told me I could stay there as long as I wanted. I didn't ask many questions. I just needed somewhere quiet. I reached the gravel road around noon. The sky looked pale and dry, and the cold air felt sharp when I stepped out of my car. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track, surrounded by empty fields, rusted fences, and a few scattered trees with brown leaves still hanging on. I noticed right away how silent everything was. No cars, no farm equipment, no voices, not even the sound of cows or chickens. Just wind moving through the grass. The cabin wasn't big. It was built with old boards, faded to a soft gray, and the roof had a few metal sheets nailed down to keep the rain out. There was a small porch with 2 steps, both uneven and cracked in the middle. A single window faced the field, and I could see a thin curtain inside hanging sideways. When I unlocked the door, it scraped against the floor, making a dragging sound that echoed in the small space. Inside, everything smelled like dry wood and old dirt. There was a single bed against the wall, a narrow table, a small shelf with a few chipped plates left behind, and a metal stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag on the table and took a slow walk around the place. The floor creaked under every step, even when I tried to walk lightly. It felt old but safe enough. By late afternoon, I decided to walk along the fence line behind the cabin. The farmland stretched farther than I expected. Empty fields rolled out in every direction, with patches of tall grass showing where things had once grown but hadn't been touched in a long time. The sun was low and bright, making my shadow long on the ground. I kept walking until I reached a broken section of fence. On the other side was a thin path cutting through a thicker patch of grass, like something or someone had walked that way many times. It didn't look like a common farm path. The grass wasn't flattened in a clean line. It was bent and twisted in uneven shapes, almost like bodies had pushed through it in a hurry. I didn't like the look of it, so I turned back toward the cabin. When the sun dropped behind the hills, the temperature fell fast. By the time I got inside again, the cold had settled deep into the wood, and I had to wrap myself in a thick blanket just to stop shaking. As the night grew darker, the silence around the cabin felt heavier. The wind barely moved, and the fields outside looked completely still. I tried to read a book I brought, but the quiet made it hard to focus. Every small noise in the cabin, wood shifting, something tapping outside, the window rattling, felt louder than it should have. Around midnight, I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling while the cold crept around me. It must have been close to 2 in the morning when I first heard it. A faint sound out in the field. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. It was a soft, dragging noise, something moving slowly through the grass. I ignored it at first, but it didn't stop. Came and went, paused and returned again, moving in different spots each time. I couldn't see anything through the window because the glass had fogged from the cold. I tried to sleep, but the dragging sound continued. Sometimes it got closer, sometimes it moved farther away. Then there was a new noise, something like a dull thump against the ground. Not loud, not sharp, just a steady, heavy sound, spaced out like slow steps. I pressed my back against the wall and held my breath, listening carefully. The steps moved closer to the cabin, very slowly, one after another. I didn't want to look out the window, but the sounds wouldn't stop. I finally forced myself to sit up and move the curtain a little. The field looked empty in the moonlight, just tall grass blowing very lightly. But then I saw something, a dark shape near the broken fence line. It wasn't standing. It wasn't walking. It looked like someone crawling, their body low to the ground, moving in short jerks, disappearing into patches of grass and then appearing again a little closer. I froze. My breath stopped in my throat. The figure didn't move like anything normal. It dragged itself, paused, then dragged again. I couldn't make out any details from that distance, but the movement alone was enough to make my chest tighten. I slowly backed away from the window and sat on the bed, gripping the blanket with both hands. I stayed that way for nearly an hour, listening as the dragging sound circled the cabin. Not fast, not aggressive, just slow, steady movement, like something unsure of where it wanted to go. Near dawn, the noise stopped completely. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light finally came, I opened the door a little and looked outside. The field was empty again, but the grass around the cabin looked disturbed, pressed in uneven patches like something had moved through it repeatedly during the night. I walked out far enough to see everything more clearly. The marks led away from the cabin toward the broken fence. They lined up perfectly with the strange path I saw the day before. I packed my things right away. I didn't wait to see if anything was still out there. I didn't take chances. The cold morning air burned my lungs as I loaded my bag into the car. Before I got in, I took one last look at the field. Nothing moved. No sounds. But the feeling of being watched stayed strong, like the empty farmland held its breath, waiting for me to leave. I drove away without looking back. Later that week, I returned the key to my coworker and told him the cabin seemed too old for me to stay in. I didn't mention anything else. I didn't talk about the dragging sound, the patches in the grass, or the crawling figure near the fence. I knew how it would sound out loud. I barely understood it myself. All I knew for certain was that someone or something had been out there that night, moving through the fields in a way that no person should move. Something that didn't stand, didn't walk, didn't run, just crawled slowly and patiently in the dark. I never went back to that farm, and I never asked about its history. But sometimes when I lie awake at night, I remember the shape in the field and the quiet weight of the darkness pressing against the cabin walls. I remember the dragging sound moving closer and closer, and how the grass outside looked bent the next morning. And I know that whatever I heard out there was real. Not a ghost, not a story, not something my tired mind imagined. Something lived in those fields, hidden in the tall grass and the silent night, moving slowly toward the cabin while I lay awake, listening. And I'm certain that if I had stayed one more night, it would have reached the door. I didn't plan to go back to the cabin. After everything, I never wanted to see that place again. But when my sister called and said she had something waiting there for me, some old documents my ex-wife had left behind, I didn't think twice. It was a Thursday in late October 2008, and I was 36 years old. The air was cold in the mountains near Cedar Ridge, Idaho, where the cabin stood, tucked deep into a forgotten valley. My truck crunched over the frost-hardened dirt road, headlights slicing through the morning mist. The trees on either side were bare, skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky, and the faint smell of decaying leaves filled the air. I tried to breathe slowly, telling myself I was there for a reason, but the memories clawed at me anyway. The cabin hadn't changed much, though time had left its mark. The roof sagged in places, and the paint was peeling, gray streaks running down the weathered wooden siding. The small porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out of the truck. A thin layer of frost made the boards slick, and I caught myself on the railing. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of dust and old pine. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, revealing furniture draped with sheets and boxes stacked in corners. I could feel the weight of all those years pressing in. Memories I hadn't wanted to face, memories I hadn't realized I'd buried so carefully. The documents were supposed to be in a small chest that had belonged to my ex, Laura. I found it in what used to be the living room, tucked against the wall. It was heavy, the wood worn smooth by time and use. As I lifted the lid, a pile of papers and old letters met my eyes. Most of it was mundane. Financial statements, insurance papers, legal notices. But beneath them, there were letters I hadn't seen before. Letters she had written to herself. Notes about her fears, her plans, her life after we separated. I sank into a chair, the dust on its surface rising in small clouds around me, and started reading. Hours passed. The sunlight waned, and shadows stretched across the floor, creeping into corners where the light couldn't reach. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan. I didn't notice at first. I was too absorbed in her words, the careful way she had chronicled her struggles and triumphs after we split. But then, a sound made me pause. It was faint, at first, just the shift of something heavy on the floor above me. I froze. The cabin had been empty since she left years ago, and now it was just me. I told myself it was probably an animal. There were always raccoons or stray cats around here, but the sound came again, louder this time, deliberate. My heart started to race, and I could feel sweat prickling my neck. I grabbed the small wrench I kept in my truck, a habit I had developed over the years for situations like this, and slowly made my way toward the staircase. Each step creaked beneath my weight, loud in the quiet of the cabin. The floorboards above groaned in response. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out, dark and narrow. I moved carefully, shining the flashlight I had in my pocket along the walls. Nothing. The doors to the bedrooms were closed. I checked each one, moving slowly, the flashlight beam trembling in my grip. The first room was empty, just the old bed frame and a mattress with no sheets. The second room was the same, abandoned furniture, dust everywhere. But as I pushed the door open to the third, I stopped. There, in the corner, was a pile of old clothes. They looked familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. A jacket, a pair of boots, a scarf, items that had belonged to Laura. How had they ended up here? I hadn't seen her come back, hadn't known anyone had been in the cabin since she left. My mind raced, trying to explain it. Maybe someone had cleaned out the place but left a few things behind. Maybe I had imagined it. But then I saw it, a note tucked under the jacket. It was in her handwriting. "Don't come looking." The words were simple, but my chest tightened as if a hand had closed around it. I dropped the flashlight and it clattered to the floor. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the note, the hair on my arms standing on end. The sound of the wind outside seemed louder now, echoing through the empty cabin like whispers. I felt completely exposed, the isolation of the place pressing down on me. My first instinct was to run, but I had come too far. I had a mission, and I wasn't about to leave without finishing it. I went back downstairs and packed the chest into my truck. Each creak of the floorboards sounded magnified, as if the cabin itself were watching me, aware of my presence. By the time I shut the truck bed, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the clearing. The sky was a deep orange, fading into a muted purple. The forest around me seemed alive in a way that unsettled me. Every branch swayed. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whisper. I tried to ignore it and started the truck. The drive back was tense. Every snapping branch, every deer startled by my headlights, set my nerves on edge. When I finally reached the highway and the familiar smell of asphalt replaced the earthy smell of the forest, I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. At home, I spread the documents across the kitchen table. I read every letter, every note, every scrap of paper. It was like piecing together a life I had left behind, a life that had moved on without me. By the end of the night, I felt a strange sense of closure. Seeing the cabin, being there alone, confronting the remnants of my past, it all made something click inside me. Laura had moved on. I had moved on. And the cabin, as eerie and unsettling as it had felt, was just a place, a container of memories. Nothing more, nothing less. I made a small fire in the backyard later, just sitting on a chair with the chest beside me. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the night air. I thought about the cabin, about the silence, about the fear that had gripped me there. It hadn't been supernatural. It hadn't been anything I couldn't explain. It was just isolation, memory, and the power of the mind to make shadows out of emptiness. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I knew I wouldn't go back to that cabin again. Not because it was haunted or cursed, but because I didn't need it. I had faced the past, taken what I needed, and left the rest behind. And that, I realized, was enough. The wind outside had settled, the night was quiet, and I finally let myself relax. The fear had been real, yes, but so was the relief. I was finally done. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Maine. I was 32 at the time, worn down by the noise and stress of city life in Boston. I wanted a break from everything, just me, my old pickup truck, and my dog, Rusty, a large brown Labrador who had been my companion since I left my last relationship 2 years prior. The cabin was a small, weathered structure on the edge of a dense forest near a narrow, winding river. It looked simple from the outside, built from dark logs, with a rusted tin roof and a small porch that creaked under every step. The previous renters' reviews had been sparse but mostly positive. They mentioned that the cabin felt isolated but peaceful. That isolation is what drew me to it in the first place. I wanted silence, I wanted space, and I wanted to be entirely alone with Rusty. The first day was uneventful. I drove through long stretches of winding roads with dense trees on either side. Once I reached the cabin, I unpacked my things slowly, methodically, enjoying the quiet hum of the forest. Rusty explored every corner immediately, sniffing the wooden beams, the porch, and the overgrown bushes around the cabin. He always had this instinct that something was off, but I brushed it off as him just being overly cautious. The first night, I slept poorly, not because of any fear, but because the cabin creaked with every gust of wind. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of Rusty growling softly by the bedroom door. I got up, rubbed his head, and walked around the cabin, checking that the windows were locked and the doors secured. Nothing seemed out of place. I chalked it up to my imagination and the fact that the forest itself made strange sounds at night. By the third day, I began exploring the area. There was a narrow dirt trail that led from the cabin down to the river. The river was shallow in some spots, fast in others, and crystal clear. I spent the morning fishing and the afternoon just sitting by the water, reading an old paperback I had brought along. Rusty stayed close to me, occasionally darting off to chase birds or sniff animal tracks. It was the fourth evening when I first noticed that something was off. I had gone out for a short walk along the edge of the forest, keeping Rusty on a leash, when I noticed fresh tire tracks that didn't match mine. They were recent, going in and out of the woods in a haphazard pattern. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was strange. There was hardly any traffic that far into the forest. Whoever it was, they had come close to the cabin without me knowing. I didn't see anyone that night, but Rusty would not settle. He paced, barked at shadows moving between the trees, and growled low in his throat. I checked every lock, every window, and made sure the cabin was secure. Sleep came reluctantly, and I awoke several times to small sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional faint crunch of footsteps outside. By the fifth day, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I tried to rationalize it. Someone could just be passing by the trails, maybe campers or hunters. But as evening fell, the unease escalated. I had built a small fire in the cabin's wood stove and tried to read, but I kept hearing faint noises outside. Then I noticed something that froze me. On the porch, in the dirt near the edge of the cabin, there was a handprint. Not a full handprint, but the smudged outline of fingers pressed firmly into the soil, as if someone had been leaning on the railing and then left. Rusty's growl cut through the silence, low and warning. I stayed inside that night with the lights on, Rusty at my side. Couldn't sleep. Every creak and whistle from the forest seemed amplified. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement outside, a dragging sound, like something being pulled through the dirt. My heart pounded, but I stayed still, listening. Rusty's hair bristled, and he growled again, more aggressively. I grabbed my old hunting knife, kept close, and waited until the first signs of dawn. The next day, I decided to explore further. I followed the dirt trail deeper into the woods, keeping my eyes peeled for anything unusual. After about half an hour, I stumbled across a shallow clearing. That's when I saw it. Partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves and branches was a body. It was a man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, clearly dead for a few days. I could tell from the stiff posture and the discoloration of the skin that he had been there for some time. There were no obvious signs of struggle, but something about the way he was positioned suggested he hadn't died naturally. I froze. Rusty whimpered beside me, sensing my tension. My mind raced. I had no cell service in the cabin, and this place was miles from the nearest town. I knew I had to get help, But I couldn't just leave the body there. I marked the trail with broken branches and head back to the cabin carefully, keeping my eyes peeled for anyone else who might be around. I drove to the nearest ranger station that afternoon, explaining what I had found. They were quick to respond. By the evening, a team had followed me back to the clearing, carefully investigating and eventually removing the body. They told me later that the man had been involved in illegal activity and likely tried to hide here after something went wrong. They thanked me for my caution and bravery, emphasizing that it was not a safe place to wander off alone. After that, I returned to the cabin, but the experience had changed me. I stayed for 2 more days, but I was vigilant, constantly checking my surroundings and staying close to Rusty. When I left, I felt relief that I was going back to the safety of the city, but also a deep sense of respect for the isolation and quiet of the forest. Years later, I still think about that cabin, the stillness of the woods, and the body we found. Rusty never forgot either. Even decades later, whenever we pass a forest like that, he becomes alert, his ears up, his body tense, as if he remembers the danger we encountered that week. That summer taught me something important. The forest is quiet and peaceful, but it can also hide things that are better left unseen. You cannot always prepare for the unexpected. Sometimes, isolation reveals the reality that not all danger is loud or obvious. And sometimes, survival is as simple as paying attention to what's right in front of you and trusting the instincts of a loyal companion. I never went back to that cabin after 1998, but I still keep Rusty with me, older now, graying around the muzzle, always alert in the woods. And I remember that summer not with fear, but with a clear understanding of caution, observation, and the quiet power of nature. I didn't plan on spending that night in the cabin, but the drive through the back roads of northern Minnesota in late October left me with little choice. The sun had dipped behind the thick forest by the time I realized I had misjudged the distance to the next town. My old Jeep shivered under the weight of the rain, the wipers barely keeping up with the heavy drops. Rain had been falling steadily since mid-afternoon, soaking the forest into a slick, dark green blur. My dog, a large mutt named Gus, leaned against my leg in the passenger seat, shaking off water as he tried to curl into a dry spot. I spotted the cabin almost by accident. It was tucked behind a cluster of pine trees, half hidden, looking like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were dark, and the wood was weathered and streaked with mold, but the roof looked intact enough. I hesitated, gripping the wheel, listening to the wind push the rain against the metal of the Jeep. I could almost hear the forest breathing, the heavy thump of raindrops on leaves, the occasional crack of branches snapping under their own weight. Gus whinnied softly. I understood. He hated being wet, hated the uncertainty in the dark, hated not knowing what was out there. I steered the Jeep toward the cabin, the mud sucking at the tires, the wheels slipping every few feet. I cursed under my breath, trying to remember if I had seen the cabin on any maps. Nothing came up. That made sense. Many cabins in these woods weren't marked. They belonged to hunters or locals, left alone during the winter, forgotten by anyone else. I parked at the edge of the clearing, the Jeep groaning as it settled. I stepped out, and the cold hit me immediately. It was bone-chilling, the kind of cold that goes straight through your coat, through your skin. Gus shook again, sending droplets flying, and I grabbed his leash. The front door of the cabin was old, the wood swollen from rain. The lock looked brittle, but when I pushed, it opened with a slow, creaking groan. Inside smelled of wet wood and dust, the kind of smell that tells you no one has been there for a while. The floorboards were warped, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dirt and grime. I moved carefully, feeling for anything that might collapse under my weight. Gus padded behind me, ears alert, nose twitching at every sound. I found a fireplace, thankfully intact, and managed to get a small fire going using some old logs stacked nearby. The glow made the cabin feel warmer than it was, but the shadows stretched across the room like dark fingers. Outside, the rain drummed against the roof, sometimes punctuated by louder cracks as branches fell nearby. Gus sat by the fire, watching the door, tail low but moving slightly as he tried to stay calm. As night deepened, the wind changed. It wasn't just the wind, it was a rolling, low sound, like something was moving through the trees. I tried to tell myself it was nothing but the storm, the weight of rain against old pine trees. But then I heard a sound that made my stomach knot. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, moving through the mud outside. Not from the road, from the woods. The kind of sound you can hear even through thick walls when the storm is loud around it. I froze, listening. Gus growled, low and guttural, a sound I had never heard from him before. He pressed himself against my leg. I grabbed the fireplace poker, the closest thing to a weapon, my hand trembling. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the clearing, then started moving again, circling the cabin. Every now and then, a branch snapped closer, and my heart jumped. Hours passed. I kept the fire alive, tossing small pieces of wood, trying to convince myself that no one was out there, that I would wake up in the morning and it would just be a stormy night. But deep down, I knew someone had been following me the moment I turned off the main road. Maybe they had seen me from afar, waiting for a target foolish enough to seek shelter in the middle of nowhere. Gus stayed close. I could feel his weight shifting constantly, his ears flicking toward every creak and groan of the cabin. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear, and I dozed lightly, always with one eye open. When I woke, it was completely silent. The storm had passed. The forest outside was calm, damp and dark, the ground slick with rain. Muddy paw prints circled the cabin, and I could see footprints too. Someone had walked around the building in the night. My stomach churned. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could carry, tied Gus's leash tightly to my belt, and pushed the Jeep out of the mud. The ground was slippery, and for a moment I thought we might get stuck. But luck, or maybe just pure force, carried us out onto the road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station over 20 miles away. My arms sore, my clothes soaked, Gus panting in the passenger seat. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I had been, and I didn't look back at the forest. Days later, I found a report in the local news. A cabin had been broken into around the time I was there. The owner hadn't lived there, but they were cleaning it out. Someone had been squatting, maybe waiting for people to stumble in. Nothing was taken from me, probably because I had arrived late, probably because they never got close enough to see me. I never went back to those woods. Gus never wanted to ride in that Jeep again on rainy nights. I can't say I sleep perfectly now, even years later. I remember the smell of wet pine, the way the floorboards creaked under my feet, the sound of footsteps circling outside. And I remember the way Gus looked at me that night, eyes wide and ears back, knowing more than I did about the danger we had narrowly escaped. Sometimes I drive past that area on dry, sunny days, and the forest looks peaceful, almost inviting. But I know better. That cabin isn't haunted in any supernatural sense. It's worse. People living in the shadows, waiting for the wrong person to show up. And I know, without question, that if we hadn't found that cabin when we did, I wouldn't be here to write this. Gus would have been at my side no matter what, but I don't think he could have saved me from what was out there, moving quietly, waiting. Now, when I take him into the woods, I stick to the trails. I make sure we're visible, never alone, and always prepared. I still think about that night almost every time it rains. The way the cabin looked at first, abandoned and harmless, hides what's really there. And I've learned that sometimes, the The scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the people hiding just out of sight, blending into the dark until it's almost too late. I never thought a weekend trip to a cabin near Pine Hollow State Park would turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 24, restless and craving something to shake me out of the dull rhythm of city life. A few friends and I decided to rent a small cabin a few miles off the main road, deep enough that the only lights for miles were stars and the occasional distant car. I drove my old Jeep, with a dog-eared map folded on the passenger seat, wondering if anyone would even find us if something went wrong. The cabin itself was tucked behind a dense cluster of pines, its wooden frame darkened by years of rain. Moss crept along the roof and around the base, giving it a sense of being swallowed by the forest. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but the interior was surprisingly intact, dusty but structurally sound. There was a small living area with a sagging sofa, a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been lit in years, and a narrow kitchen with chipped counters. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and old wood. We arrived just before sunset, the forest painted in gold and orange. I parked the Jeep and grabbed our supplies: coolers, backpacks, sleeping bags, my stomach buzzing with the thrill of isolation. It was supposed to be a park rager weekend, a private party where we could be loud, laugh without limits, and disappear into the woods for the night. The first hours were surreal in their simplicity. We built a small fire outside, the crackle of the wood filling the quiet air. My friends unpacked music speakers and crates of drinks while I walked around the cabin, noting the strange hollows in the trees and the faint rustle of small animals. The park itself was just beyond a clearing, a trail snaking into the dark canopy. I had the uncanny sense that I wasn't just in the woods, I was inside them. By nightfall, the party was in full swing. Music thumped, our laughter bounced off the cabin walls, and the firelight made shadows dance on the trees. It felt like freedom, that reckless joy of being completely detached from responsibilities. But as midnight approached, that carefree feeling started to fray. I was the first to notice it. The woods around the cabin seemed too quiet now. No crickets, no frogs, just a cold stillness that pressed in from every side. When I stepped a few feet away from the fire to get water from the creek nearby, I could swear I heard something crunching leaves just beyond the tree-line. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and heavier than any deer I had seen. I shook it off and went back to the fire, telling myself the shadows were playing tricks on my mind. But then others started noticing strange things too. A cooler we had left near the edge of the clearing had been moved slightly, not enough to panic anyone, but enough to make us question if we had been careless. I checked the Jeep. The doors were locked, but the hood latch was loose, something that hadn't happened before. Around 2 in the morning, the woods changed. The music was lower now, almost drowned out by the wind that had picked up, rattling the cabin's old windows. One of my friends, Matt, swore he saw someone standing just at the edge of the clearing, pale and frozen like a statue, before disappearing behind the trees. No one else saw him, and he didn't want to make a big deal, but the unease was spreading. I noticed my heart was pounding in a way that wasn't just fear. It was awareness, a warning I couldn't ignore. Then came the first sound that made me freeze. Not the wind, not the trees, but footsteps, slow, measured, circling the cabin. I stepped closer to the window, trying to catch a glimpse through the firelight, and my stomach dropped. The steps weren't alone. There was a weight to them, deliberate, almost casual, like someone was walking just far enough away to watch us without being seen. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just shadows stretching in the moonlight. But then, When I turned back toward the fire, I noticed a trail of footprints leading from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin. Muddy, wide, not humanly small. I told my friends we needed to get inside and lock everything. That's when panic really set in. The music had stopped on its own, and the fire had reduced to embers. Outside, I could hear them, the crunching, circling, faint breathing of someone or something watching us. None of us slept that night. I spent hours pacing the cabin, flashlight in one hand, a baseball bat in the other, watching the shadows stretch like predators along the tree line. Morning came slowly, and the sun felt unreal. The footprints around the cabin had vanished, but there were signs that something had been there. The firewood was scattered, a chair knocked over, nothing else. No marks on the cabin, no one hiding inside, but the fear lingered like a thick fog. I knew we couldn't stay. We packed up in silence, my hands trembling as I loaded the Jeep. On the drive out, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following. The park's entrance never felt more like an escape hatch in my life. When we finally hit the paved road, I let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Back in the city, we laughed about it, trying to make it a story, a cautionary tale. But none of us could shake the feeling that the woods were alive in a way we couldn't explain. I didn't go back. None of us did. And even years later, every time I pass a dense park at night, I remember that weekend, the quiet that wasn't quiet, and the footprints that seemed almost patient. Looking back, the ending feels simple but absolute. We survived, yes, because we left. We didn't fight or confront, we didn't get caught. The forest didn't chase us past the clearing, and no one ever followed our trail. But survival was the whole point. Sometimes, leaving is the victory. The cabin is probably still there, still waiting, still surrounded by the same quiet that hides more than it reveals. And I don't need to go back to know it. The lesson, painfully clear, is that some places are better left empty, no matter how fun they promise to be. That weekend taught me that fear isn't always about seeing. It's about knowing someone or something is there, even if you never see it, and trusting your gut is sometimes the only way to make it out alive.